Alright, the last step in setting wedged tenons together is creating the wedges for the tenon. So here you'll notice everything is that we've already done. A couple things I want to talk about here. First and foremost is the dimension and grain orientation of what the wedge material will become. First of all, since this fits into a mortise, I need to think about the wedges also fitting inside of that mortise. If I make the wedge material larger than the tenon, it's going to be interfered with by the mortise. It won't go in and it won't do its job. So these are the same dimension. Maybe that's a better angle for showing this. This is the same dimension. It could be slightly undersized, that's fine, but if it's slightly thicker than that of the tenon, this doesn't work. So I really need to make sure that this is well sized, and I'm happy with this. The other thing is somewhat of an aside, but we need to start thinking about getting a wood that is of equal or greater density to that of the tenon material. So let's say I'm using really soft wood like pine or Douglas fir or something. If I were to put a harder wedge into that, oak, maple, cherry, basically anything is harder than a pine or a softwood, then it will actually start compressing those fibers and spreading this thing apart. If I do this the reverse way, if I use the softer wood as the wedge material, that softer wood is the part that's going to get compressed. And so with poplar, it's a soft wood here. I have maple, which is one of the hardest. So I'm going in the right direction with this. A lot of people will use darker wood here just as an aesthetic choice. Sometimes ebony or walnut, something darker depending on what your aesthetic is. Sometimes you don't want to see it at all. So to downplay the aesthetic piece of this, you can just use the same material, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so the last piece here is going to be grain orientation. And so this is a piece of the cheek that was cut off from this material. And if we think about the wood, the long grain here is always where the strength is going to be. If I were to change the orientation of our wedge material and put this cross grain and try to wedge this thing home, again, assuming this length is going to be able to fit inside of the mortise, like so. Yeah, like so. This is too thick. Then we have to start thinking about this. All the strength driving into the mortise, into this orientation here, is all based on the wedge having the long grain orientation so that it will do its job. If I try to reverse this, you'll see the grain running more or less diagonally here, left upper corner to right. Then this is really weak, and when you start driving this thing in, anytime there's a little bit of resistance with this as it's driven in, it's just going to snap, and so this doesn't work. Smaller piece here, I can't break this because that's where all the strength is, but again, across the grain it breaks very easily. So because of that, grain orientation here is in the vertical axis, so when I'm cutting it, I want to have access to getting into these things. Alright, now I need to start thinking about dimensioning of this. So the length of my tenon is a little bit over an inch. It's about 1 1/8, and I want to make my wedge pieces much longer than that. So this one is almost 2 inches, and that's plenty. I want to lay out here on the top a finished thickness of that wedge, so that'll be the part that extends out from the outside, and that creates more of a striking surface for a mallet or hammer. Usually it's a hammer. And then from there, how do I do this? I just want to connect those two lines, one on the length and one on the thickness, and that creates the dimension of my wedge. The next piece that I want to do is I just want to draw a line straight down and then across. Oops. Better. So I have laid out here 2 different wedges, and that's great. trusty saw. That looks pretty great. I'm cutting here at an angle. It's about to fall off. I was hoping to pull this off of the edge here, as you saw, so that it kind of tapers down to nothing. And by doing so, this will easily fit into this environment and go through where I need to, plenty of extra length. If this is not thick enough to do its job, I can easily trim off a little bit of the end of this. I still need to have it at least less than the thickness of this kerf. Otherwise, if it's too thick, I'm going to have this situation, and it just won't start to feed into that wedged position. So that's one. The next cut is going to be using that second set of lines that I've created and sawing straight down. Cross-cutting with my ripping saw. I know everybody hates that. I can hear the comments now, but now I have two functional wedges for getting this thing to land and drive home. Let me grab my mortise. So what I've done thus far has not compromised the overall dimension of the tenon. My mortise is obviously going to be fine. But driving these things home, you'll notice that I have a gap here on the bottom of this mortise, and that was by design. I can drive this wedge in, drive this wedge in, and at the time of gluing up, the gap has gone away. By having the extension of this tenon, now the wedges is pulling this piece apart, so it's now greater in size than the dimension of the mortise. So physically very, very, very difficult to have this thing pull through or get compromised in. Sorry, I should always double check that you're in frame. There we are. Sorry about all that. So now with the wedges in place, I've extended the overall width of the tenon. So it's going to be very difficult for this thing to start prying apart. A little bit of glue on the interior of this. It's going to be virtually impossible to have this thing break loose. So that's kind of the idea of wedge tenons. Hopefully this is helpful, and good luck. Thanks everyone.